Hey summoners, make sure you're subscribed to the Mobalytics YouTube channel and hit that bell button, that way you're always up to date and part of our notification squad. Hello summoners and welcome back to the Mobalytics patch 8.19 video tier list. This patch is the patch that the World Championships will be played on, which is very exciting. Worlds will start next week with the play-in stage starting on October 1st, and for solo queue we will be on this patch for 2 weeks, and then we can start moving into some transition patches before the preseason. Anyway, let's get into the changes and the tier list, and this patch is interesting because this patch is all buffs. Every single change is a buff. Starting off in the top lane, we've got some buffs to Darius and Fiora, who are going to be doing a bit better at killing tanks and doing their job. We've got a couple carries mixing around and doing quite well. Jax has popped up as a great pick for both top lane and jungle, and overall the role is mostly stable, aside from a couple of the direct changes that we've seen, and things like Sion, Garen are still as good as ever. Darius received a direct buff on this patch, and he's going to be dealing much more damage. This also means that he might see a bit of build optimization and a switch of his main keystone rune. Typically right now you see Darius is taking Conqueror, but you could see either a phase rush or even something as strange as a glacial augment Darius, which is something I've seen before, might be pretty good. If you buff his damage, that means the more utility or tanky style of play might be more effective in combination with this. So he's moved his way up to A tier. Jax is another champion that is stomping a lot of games. As for Jax, he just scales so well, with damage options being less good than sustain options currently, and games going slightly longer. Jax is really oppressive on 2 items and is nearly unkillable on 5 items. He wants to snowball, but he doesn't necessarily need to due to just how much he scales. He's a great team fighter, he's good at split pushing. Jax gives you everything you need out of the top lane, and that's why you're seeing him draw a lot of bans right now. For high elo top lane, the buffs to Fiora feel much nicer for her, and we might see her even pop up in Worlds now due to the buffs that she got and her prevalence at beating tanks, but the rest of it is pretty standard in what you might expect. Your higher skill cap champions like Riven, Camille, Rengar, Jace Aurelio all doing very well. Alright, on to the jungle role, where we see mostly the same thing as last time. We do have a couple things moving around. We have Hecarim in there, Shyvana in there. A couple things have changed, but this is the most stable role this patch, aside from our first pick of the week. My pick of the week ended up being Lee Sin because it was something that I tried personally after discovering that there were a few high elo players doing very well with a Dark Harvest Lee Sin build, and in the right hands while playing optimally, he can be quite oppressive and dominant. The Dark Harvest build gives Lee Sin a bit of late game scaling, which he normally struggles with, and even though you won't necessarily always have a stack of your Dark Harvest ready when you are ganking in the early game, Lee Sin's ganks and damage is so strong that you don't even necessarily miss the old electrocute damage. His clear speed is godlike, so he stacks Dark Harvest quickly, he's good at dueling and winning solo queue games. Despite his lackluster win rate, he's just really hard to play. Onto the high elo jungle list, this is where we see the Kha'Zix buffs come into play, and the reason why he's not on the low elo one is not only is he pretty hard to play, but the low elo meta for junglers tends to be more tanky style junglers. As in the high elo one, you see almost every single one is a carry. There's only like really 1 or 2 tanks on the entire list for the jungle role in high elo, which makes Kha'Zix do much better against these dueling type junglers. Moving on to the mid lane tier list, we have a buff to Liandry's Torment on this patch, which means that there's a couple champions rising up, things like Cassiopeia, or even things like, I'm not saying you need to play it, but AP Kog'Maw got Liandry's buff and the range on his nah, I'm just messing with you. Something like Malzahar actually does really well with Liandry's, so Malzahar was already in A tier, and now you'll see that the rise of Malzahar is in both lists. Malzahar is very easy to play, is incredibly effective, has a great ultimate, and makes you pay that tax on his ultimate of 1300 gold. The problem with the champion is that if he is too good, he's very hard to balance and really stop due to just how easy he is to execute and how effective one ability can be. He will push the wave constantly, he will siege on you, he has a nice silence, he's one of the only champions left in the game with silences after they've removed so many, and what makes him just so darn good, of course, is that ulti. The rest of the mid lane tier list looks somewhat normal in what you can expect. We've also seen the rise of Diana, which is going to be Adam's pick of the week. Diana is much stronger than she has shown previously due to most players have been building the wrong items on her. Typically the build was Nashor's into Zhonya's. We recommend trying out Spellbinder into Oblivion Orb into Deathcap, and after Deathcap it can be pretty situational. You could complete the orb into Morello's, you could build Zhonya's or Nashor's if you want to split push, and then Void Staff to help against teams with a lot of magic resist. This build gives her much more consistency in one-shotting your targets with a simple R into W into Q instead of having to weave in auto attacks. Keep in mind that you'll have to survive her pre-6 laning phase as it's very weak, but she becomes easy to execute once you get her ultimate. The Spellbinder build makes her a brain-dead one-shot Rengar type mid-lane mage assassin, just kill you with a couple of abilities, and that's fun and really effective. For the high elo mid lane tier list, we have Cassiopeia moving into S tier, and we see Talon still doing well across higher elos. This is probably because the Talon 1-tricks are better in high elo, but that also just proves that he does have a decently high learning curve. So maybe we'll consider moving Talon's learning curve to orange in the same category as Twisted Fate or Orianna. Other things that do drop down, yes, Diana will get slightly worse, and Twisted Fate will get slightly better. Malzahar is also still doing very well in high elo, and with the Liandry's buff, again, he's going to be in there. Alright, moving on to the bottom lane, we only have 2 S tier bot lane carries in Yasuo and Misfortune. This is because some of the other things have gotten significantly worse, but we do have priority increasing on things like Sivir, we have priority decreasing on things like Kai'Sa and Jhin, and we have our third and final pick of the week in Heimerdinger, and a couple other things are really good, and you'll see with Lucian he's been popping up as well. For Heimerdinger bot lane, he is still a good champion. This is something that we've seen before, obviously this season, but with wave clear, gank assist, and burst, in bot lane Heimer has everything that he needs. If you are a champion that can be described that way, the typical problem with them is that they lack consistent damage to win teamfights and take down objectives just like a normal ADC would, but Heimer does not have that problem due to his turrets and his upgraded turrets. He synergizes a lot with all of the supports, with the exception of enchanters losing a bit of effectiveness with their buffs, but enchanters aren't exactly what's dominating right now, pretty much aside from Sona and Nami, who can still do well. We're not really seeing a lot of Lulu and Janna, and we're seeing more things like Taric, Zyra, Zilean, Thresh, Pyke, so this is what Heimerdinger does well with. For the high elo marksmen and bot laners, we do see Draven and Lucian being better. Swain drops down a bit, but is still not that bad. Heimer does move out just because he can get punished in higher MMRs by better junglers, and we see Lucian again popping up. He's really good, and you've probably seen him in higher elo streams. Things like Kai'Sa will get better, Vayne is pretty stable, and MF and Yasuo do go down. And lastly but not least, moving on to supports, Brand, Nami, and Sona still find themselves in S tier and doing very well. With the Liandry's buffs, things like Zyra might be really good, and this is something to watch out for on this patch. So if there's anything you should look directly at here and say, can this move around? Zyra may potentially be S tier. For the rest of the pool, things like Thresh and Pyke got buffed, and we will see them on the higher elo tier list in S tier. We will also see things like Janna coming back due to some direct buffs. Things like Alistar are still very good, but again in higher ranks. Taric is still great, Zilean is still great, and mage supports like Vel'Koz and Xerath are very good. For Sona, her scaling is just off the charts. The reason that Sona does well is when games take a bit longer and you have time to get your items, she becomes the best teamfighting support in the game. She's so spammable, and after level 16, she just has basically no cooldowns. All of her abilities are AoE, you just permanently buff your team and she becomes a great support. Sona still struggles in the early game, and with things like Pyke getting buffed, there's not really much that Sona can do. However, this is for lower MMRs, which is why we do see Sona drop down a bit, but with the prevalence of things like Thresh and Pyke in higher elos, that's when Sona starts to fall off. Speaking of the high elo support list, Thresh, Pyke, and Nami find themselves in S tier, and Bard and Alistar are your A tier supports. Basically, the way that you should see this support list is if your support is on this list, they are really good. We haven't necessarily included all supports here. We could throw in things like Janna and Soraka and Lulu in B tier, but we wanted to be more specific and say, if you're a high elo player, this is your list to pick from. These are your supports. The rest of them, yes, they're usable, yes, they are okay under some situations, but for the most part, for all intents and purposes, these are going to be your go-to picks. Things like Blitzcrank and Leona are situationally great, things like Taric and Gragas are situationally great, but Thresh, Nami, Pyke, Alistar, Bard are just much more consistent all across the board. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for the Mobalytics patch 8.19 video tier list. Let us know what you thought of this tier list, and let us know if you're excited for the World Championships, because we definitely are too.